Folks, it's May 18th, 2025. Let's talk a little bit about the Diddy case, dwyercrime.blog, a free site. Also, digitalassetlife.com. For those of you interested in cryptocurrency, that's a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, I believe this Diddy indictment is an outrage. Right? Maybe later in the trial they're going to actually have witnesses testify about, real crimes. But I need for folks to understand that the testimony of Cassie, Diddy's girlfriend, in my opinion, doesn't constitute racketeering, a racketeering conspiracy as listed in count 1 of the indictment. I'll put a link to the indictment in the description of this video. Right? I want people to read it for themselves. Unless the prosecution actually starts showing us real evidence, this is a hopelessly overplayed indictment. The first charge is for racketeering conspiracy. I haven't heard anything remotely resembling a racketeering conspiracy. The second count is for sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. Folks, I haven't heard anything remotely approaching that. Right? The third count is transportation to engage in prostitution. Right? I need for folks to look up the statute they cite in the indictment. Right? You will see that this is an offense that carries a maximum prison term of 7 years per count. 7. Right? Also, understand it can also be satisfied by payment of a fine. Right now, it's a bit amazing that a couple hiring a prostitute for their own pleasure is somehow violating this statute. But apparently, if I'm in New York City and I'm with my girlfriend and we decide, hey, let's hire this escort from New Jersey, I would be running afoul of this statute. Right? There was a male sex worker who testified earlier. Understand, the prosecution will meet their burden for this particular count if any of the prostitutes Diddy and Cassie hired cross state lines. Right? Here again, just to understand, this count can be extinguished by payment of a fine. Right? The court could issue a sentence and literally say, Diddy, you transported prostitutes across state lines. I'm fining you. This statute doesn't necessarily connote jail time for Diddy. The fourth cause of action is for forfeiture. Obviously, it's costing the feds a lot of money to put on this case. They're trying to make the argument that they're entitled to get some of Diddy's assets. Right? Just understand that RICO was a statutory scheme designed to go after the mob. Right? Understand, too, the transport of prostitutes across state lines was legislation that they came up with to go after the first African American heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson. So somehow they've cobbled these causes of action to pursue a radio mogul, someone who's busy running a radio label, right? They're trying to somehow accuse him of mob related activity. Sometimes the mob is involved in prostitution rings, right? They literally are throwing the kitchen sink at him. Now, so far, Cassie has testified she was a victim of domestic violence by Diddy. I'll concede that part of the case, right? But I want people to look in the description of this video. You're going to find an article from the New York Post that highlights texts between Cassie and her on again, off again boyfriend of a decade, 10 years, Diddy. Right, folks? As a divorce lawyer, let me just break news to you. Many relationships don't work out. Right? About half of marriages end in divorce, and those are married couples. Right? Some of the texts cited by the New York Post are from after May 5th, 2016. Again, some are after, March 5th, 2016. Now, what's the importance of March 5th, 2016? Folks, that's the date of the hotel surveillance video. That's the date. So, because some of the texts are graphic, I'm not going to cite any of them. What I'm going to argue here is that the prosecution has to show force, fraud, or coercion by Diddy in forcing Cassie to engage in sexual activity. If there's any evidence that Cassie engaged in sexual activity consensually, on her own volition, right, then understand the idea of her being a victim of force, fraud, or coercion falls apart. Right? Diddy's behavior toward Cassie can't be the basis of the second count of the indictment. Right now, it's early in the case. Many criminal lawyers will tell you they try to start fast. They try to have big evidence up front. You only have one chance to make a first impression. Right? Some juries will hear you, will say, wow, this just doesn't sound like sex trafficking to me. This sounds like a dispute between two swingers who were in a relationship. This sounds like, a guy who, according to the prosecution's witness, the male sex worker, a guy who is off at the side while this sex worker is with his girlfriend, right, who answers the door and lets the sex worker in. Without quoting any of the texts, I need for people to understand that in the texts, right, again, some of them after the hotel surveillance incident, Cassie's talking about being out buying, things for the next freak off. right? She's not in the store with Diddy, who's holding a gun, a knife, or is physically threatening her. No, this is something she's doing on her own. There's rapport between the two of them about, the fun they've had. Right, folks? Realize it's a multi year relationship. They're talking about the fun they had. They're talking about all the things they did. Right, folks? If you have this cachet of text messages between two lovers involved in what turns out to be an on and off again 10-year relationship, it's astonishing. It is astonishing that the prosecution would try to present it to a jury in a different light. In my opinion, the text messages, and they're over several years, between Cassie and Diddy make it impossible to argue that she was involved in sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. Folks, the facts simply don't fit. They don't. Now, I will say, this is supposed to be a multi-week trial. Let me bluntly say that the indictment talks about kidnapping and other things that the prosecution hasn't presented yet. Right? Maybe the meat and potatoes of the trial is going to be based on other people. Folks, it can't be based on Cassie. Again, the text messages don't make that possible. Diddy has no burden here. The prosecution has the burden of proof, which they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. I understand Cassie's 8 months pregnant. Someone in the comment section said maybe they led with her because she's about to have a baby and might not be available later in the trial. Okay, fair enough. I need for folks to understand that apart from the fact that Cassie and Diddy hired prostitutes. That's the other problem I have with Cassie, besides the $30 million. Right? She is an active participant in hiring prostitutes. Right? So this is like the mob trial, and it shouldn't be viewed as a mob trial, right? But that's how it's pled. This is like the mob trial where they put Sammy the Bull Gravano on the stand. And he's talking about crimes he was actually involved in. Now, in a mob setting, we say, okay, we understand they have to have people like Sammy the Bull Gravano on the stand. Because this is the only way they can get John Gotti or whoever else is in the background, the target of their investigation. Well, just understand here, the star witness so far has been a woman who was involved in getting prostitutes with Diddy. In other words, the star witness is in a sense a co-conspirator if you believe the couple hiring prostitutes and having a prostitute come over and, for sex is a crime. If you believe that, right? Well, they have someone on the stand who was involved in getting prostitutes to cross state lines, so to speak. Let's remember, the male sex worker actually talks about texting Cassie directly. Right? So, you know, Cassie has her own set of problems. The financial motive also matters. Right? Where she sued Diddy civilly, right? Goes the civil route, not the criminal route, right? Sues Diddy civilly based on a certain set of facts. She doesn't want to leave herself open to malicious prosecution, right? She has a motive to maintain her story, the one that got her $30 billion. Right? So, in addition to being a co-conspirator in terms of the transporting of prostitutes, right, Cassie also has a financial motive to pursue her testimony. But understand, even if you believe her testimony, it's not enough to show criminal culpability for Diddy under these charges. Right? You know, think it through. They're saying racketeering conspiracy. Who did Diddy conspire with to transport prostitutes across state lines? Right? Isn't that Cassie, the prosecution's star witness? Then, of course, any statements by Cassie, particularly in written form, her texts, where she's talking about having fun and all this other stuff, right? At freak offs and how they did a lot of things at freak offs. Folks, that, in my opinion, obviates any chance of the prosecution showing that she was a victim by force, fraud, or coercion, right? Which is needed for the second count here. They actually put it in the title, as you will see in the indictment. They put it in the title. Right, folks, the minute you hear that Cassie is texting Diddy, and the texts are talking about the fun they had and all this other stuff, right, folks, the idea of 12 jurors all agreeing, wow, you know, the prosecution has proven to me beyond a reasonable doubt that Cassie is a victim of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, in my eyes, is an impossibility. Right? It's simply an impossibility. Right? This is a he said, she said type case. The male sex worker in the room who they've presented, right, didn't say anything about Cassie being there against her will. Right? He does witness or hears some scuffle between the two. Right? We'll even assume that that's Diddy being abusive. Right, folks? As I see it, this is a domestic violence case so far. Now, maybe they're going to have other women testify, right, about being victims of sex trafficking. Right? I'm curious how they're going to pull that off. Right? The indictment refers to other women, not by name, but mentions other women. Right? All I've heard about are swingers inviting a third party into their bed. Right? The only angle that involves any kind of illegality to me is the idea that the person they invited is a prostitute. Had it been a neighbor, I'd be wondering why the case is even being presented in federal court. Right? But it's a prostitute. Okay. They have they might have a pattern, it might be shown, of inviting sex workers into their bed. All right, fine. Folks, who's being forced? Who's being defrauded? Right? Who's being coerced here? Let me also say, too, this is one of the texts that I will reference. Right? In one text, Cassie complains to Diddy. Right? Not all of the texts are friendly. She complains to Diddy that she's being treated like, let's use a term here, it's her term, a side piece. Right? A side piece. Folks, in the parlance, when someone you're dating complains to you that she's being treated as a side piece, that means she wants a more intense relationship. Right? She doesn't want to be on the side. She wants to be your girl, period. Right? Let me also point out again, the hotel video, March the 5th, 2016. Cassie and Diddy attended the 2018 NBA All-Star Game. Right? They're there, right by the court. Right? Anybody with film of the game can look and see them. Right? They're together 2 years after the hotel surveillance video. Right, folks? Couples argue. Right? Go to family court. Just look up where the divorce cases are pending. Right? Divorce trials that don't involve sensitive issues, child abuse, and things like that are open to the public. Right? You'll go in and you'll hear about couples being together for 10 years if they're lucky. As I said in an earlier video, that's a long-term marriage in California. Right? Just food for thought. That's a long-term marriage in California. And couples argue. You have ridiculous situations. Right? I'm not here to condone in any way, shape, or form domestic violence. Right? I'm not. But let me just say, domestic violence doesn't give way, in my opinion, to a RICO charge. Let me say, too, the first count, the racketeering conspiracy. Who is Sean Combs conspiring with on the evidence we've heard so far? The male sex worker who he barely knows, right? Meets that night. Sex worker's testimony is that he's there, he enters, he sees a guy off at the side, he doesn't even know it's Sean Combs. Right? Did they present Cassie as a conspirator? A Sean Combs conspirator? Right? Or was she presented as a victim? And then was the jury, then hearing a story of consensual sex involving a prostitute? Right? As one of the opening parts of this trial. Right, folks? If the prosecution's leading with, consensual sex acts, I hope the jury is asking themselves, why is this in federal court? Right? A couple hiring a prostitute. Where's the sex trafficking? Right? The text messages from Cassie in my opinion, prevent the prosecution from even having a reasonable chance of using her to prove sex trafficking done by force, fraud, or coercion. Right? This is a woman who continued to see Diddy for years after the hotel video. Right? For years. As I said too, if the prosecution wants to use that as the linchpin for the claim that Cassie, who's talking about enjoying freak-offs in the text messages, wanted to leave that one, and Diddy got physical with her in the hall to prevent her from doing so, right? Let's hope the prosecution is not trying to convince us of that by just the testimony of someone who received $30 million and who arguably is Diddy's co-conspirator in the transporting of prostitutes across state lines. Give the description of this video a look. Read through the actual indictment, right? Think about the testimony that's been presented so far. The Don Richard testimony, I'll put it to you this way. Diddy having a physical domestic violence interaction with Cassie while she's cooking really has little to do with sex trafficking, doesn't it? Right? Dawn Richard isn't 8 months pregnant, as far as I know. Right? They view her as one of their most powerful witnesses. Right? They had her testify first week of the trial. Right? This seems to me to be some move by the prosecution to convince the jury that Diddy is a bad person. Right? Let all of us be reminded that these trials are actually on causes of action. Right? Criminal counts. I can be a juror at a trial involving someone who's not the friendliest person, who's done things that I don't like, that are unrelated to the trial in front of me. That's not grounds to convict the person of things like sex trafficking. Right? Using force, fraud, and coercion. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours, especially after you've read the indictment and then read the New York Post article on the text messages. Understand, folks, there are dozens and dozens of pages of text messages. These are just a select few. Let me also say, too, I've been involved in divorce cases where the couple is so vicious toward each other that you're shocked that they were ever married. Right? Let's face it, relationships are tough. Right? The fact that Diddy and Cassie were together for off and on 10 years, right, I'm sure has left some frayed, angry feelings. Right? What the text messages do is they take us back to the date when they were sent. They let us know what the couple was thinking then. Again, my argument here is simple. The text messages sent by Cassie negate the prosecution's attempt to meet the very high burden in criminal court of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Right? If I'm a juror and I see text messages where, she's remembering these freak-offs fondly, then I'm going to be thinking to myself, whoa, sex trafficking sounds like something different, doesn't it? Those are my thoughts. I look forward to yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.